The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round again, the years keep rolling by.
This is one actually that I got from Simon Brooks, and it's a very interesting story because it's a story of a man who has no story. It is the midwinter solstice, and the boatman, who has really been too busy taking goods, services, and people and animals from the mainland to island to island to island. He is working all the time. He doesn't have time for any recreation whatsoever, and certainly doesn't have time for a wife. He decides to go to the midwinter ceilidh. He goes in and looks at the people, and then he realizes that in order to go and be at the ceilidh, you've got to do something to entertain everyone else. They sing, they dance, they have music, but he can't sing because his voice is too hoarse from the wind in his face all the time. His hands are too coarse and calloused to play a musical instrument, and certainly he doesn't dance, and he has no stories. So as the turn goes around the room, he decides to slip out the door because he doesn't want to embarrass himself. Outside of the door, there's a girl, and she's crying, and she's holding a baby close to her. And he says, "Oh, my dear, what's wrong?" And she says, I want to get to the island where my mother and my aunt are waiting for me, and no boatman will take me. And she cries, and he says, "My dear, I'll take you. Where do you want to go?" And she mentions an island. He said, "But dear, that island is uninhabitable. There's no life on that island." She says, "My mother and aunt are there. They're expecting me. Please take me." He knows there's nothing on that island, but to reassure her, he lets her go in the boat. And they row along. The way is long. The night is dark. And she starts to tell his story. Now, he's a very tender-hearted man. And he hears this story, his heart is touched, and he realizes how young and beautiful she is. But he hasn't known anything of women. But he falls in love. He slips into love. Then they get to the island. He's been to that island many times before, and he knows that there's nothing there. There are a few cloudberries, and he often goes there to rest while he's fishing. And there's a little bit of seaweed, but that's all. He's explored the island. They land at the island. He pulls the boat up, and she says, "Come." And they go a little way, and there's a path that's going straight up into the island. And he knows there's no path there. And they come to a house where he knows no house has ever been. And she invites him in for a dram. He goes in and meets the mother and the aunt. And the dram turns into a meal. And the meal makes him drowsy as he sits in front of the fire. He falls asleep for just one moment and then wakes up with a start. And she says, "Why not stay the night?" And he says, "I cannot stay the night. An unmarried man like me and a house full of women." She says, "Well, then why don't you get married?" He says, "Really?" And she says, "Yes, you're quite the catch." So they marry in the old way, and he never leaves again. It is a good place. There are things growing. There are cabbages and onions and tomatoes, and there's a milk goat, and there are chickens. And it's just a wonderful place to be. And eventually they have 6 children. They are content and happy. Then one day, one of the boys has been wandering around the island, and he finds an oar. He brings it to his father and said, "What's this for?" And the father thinks for a while, then remembers, and said, "Where'd you find that?" And they all go to the place where it's found. They go through the gorse and the mud and the rocks, and they stumble over and find the boat and the other oar. And the kids say, "What's that for?" He says, "I'll show you." And he pulls the boat out, takes the oars, and he goes into the sea, picks up the oars and starts rowing, and his body remembers. He remembers the joy of that feeling. And he rows and rows, and his wife calls back to him, but he can't hear her. He's too far out. And he rows full of joy and rows and rows. But as he rows on, everything becomes very, very dark. But eventually he does reach the shore of the mainland. He stops. He gets out of the boat, and the moment he sets foot out of that boat, things change. He doesn't know why, but things change. He feels very old and very tired and very drained. But then he remembers his wife and children, gets back into the boat and rows back. But as he rows, a mist comes up, and it covers everything, and he has some trouble finding the island, but he does find the island. And he goes, and he looks for the path up, but there is no path. And he looks for the house, there is no house. It is the uninhabitable island that he had known for years and years. He runs all over the islands. He finds nothing. So he gets back in his boat and rows back to the mainland. And there he hears music and laughter. And the music is the same song that he heard those many years ago. He goes into the hall where there's a gathering of people in the midwinter Colonie. And he burst in and says to the chieftain, "My wife, I've lost my wife, I can't find her." The chieftain says, You never had a wife. He said, "Oh, yes, I did," and proceeded to tell the story that I just told you. Well, the chieftain was so happy, he acclaimed him the winner of the storytelling contest for the evening. No, says the boatman, "no, that story is true." And they congratulate him. But every winter solstice, he rows out to that island, and he looks for his wife and his children. He does this for years and years and years, until finally he is an old man, very weak. He can barely hold the oars. He can barely row. But he makes the way out to the island thinking, this will be the last time that I can do that. He comes to the island. The boat hits the shore. He gets out to pull it up, and then he turns, and there is his wife with her arms open and all the children smiling around her. And that's the story.
I like mythic tales. And this is one, I did a solstice storytelling event a few weeks ago around the winter solstice. And I like ravens. And so I found this one from, I found it, a woman named Misha Maha was the one who wrote what I found. And it's a Norse tale. And today it goes like this. In the beginning, Odin, the All-Father, used to love to walk around the roots of the great tree Yggdrasil, in whose branches the 9 worlds were held. And Odin was curious as for what was going on in the upper worlds, and in the world of men, Midgard, and in the worlds beneath them. And every day would wonder at what's happening. And then 2 ravens flew up and perched one on the left shoulder and one on the right shoulder. And the one on the left shoulder, her eyes were cloudy like the mist on Nephilim, and she was as white as the snow on top of the mountains. And he named this raven Hunan, which means thought. And the raven who perched on his right shoulder, he perched there, and his eyes were clear as the waters in the mountains. And this raven he named Munin, which means memory. And the ravens each morning would call out in their beautiful songs, and they would go out, and they would fly into the 9 worlds, and they would hear what people were saying of the good news and the joy of what was happening all around. And they would come back and they would perch on Odin's shoulders, and Odin would always eagerly listen to what the ravens were telling him. And when they got done, Odin would say, "This is good, but it is not enough. There is more." And each day the ravens would fly away, uncertain about where this more was, and they would come back and again tell Odin about the thoughts of mountains and the murmurings of rivers and all of the wonders of the 9 worlds. And still he would say, "There is more." So one day when the 2 ravens, Hunan and Munin, flew off, and the sun began to get close to setting, and they began to turn to fly back to Odin, Hunan said, "No. We must fly now into the darkness to see, for perhaps there is more there." And Hunan flew off into the thoughts of mankind. And when she flew into the darkness, the thoughts of humans turned from the joy and wonder of the daylight to the ponderings of the darkness. She flew into the thoughts of despair, the thoughts of greed, the dark thoughts of taking what is not theirs, the dark thoughts that humans don't dare think in the daylight. And each of those thoughts coated her feathers as she flew deeper and deeper into the darkness of human thought. Munin, he flew in the other direction. He flew into the direction of memory. The memories that humans put down, never to want to think again in the light, but that snipe at them from the dark and always rise up in the middle of the night. And Munin flew into the ashes and the burnings of the memories of loss, lost loves, lost chances. She flew into the memories of mistakes, the memories of hate, the memories of what could have been. She flew through the memories all the way to the end of time. And in the ashes and fire of the end of time, the smoke curled around her feathers and into her eyes and deep, deep into her throat. And she came back. And Hunan and Munin came back, covered now in darkness, and they flew at the darkest time of night before the dawn comes. They flew on the shoulders of Odin. Their white feathers stained black, their eyes blackened, their throats filled with the ashes so that their sweet sounds were now croaks. And they told Odin of what they had seen. And Odin said, "It is enough. Rest now." And so it is since the beginning, when the All-Father had the ravens on his shoulders. The ravens have been black before us. And they often tell us things we do not wish to remember and give us thoughts we do not wish to have. But should you ever come across a raven who is white, you know that somehow you've been brought back to the beginning before the thoughts and memories of humans turn dark. And this is why ravens are black.
This is a story, not my story, but a story I got the seed from a history teacher at the Rectory School, a boys' boarding school in Connecticut. It's sort of historical, it's cultural. Persephone was the daughter of Demeter, and Demeter was the goddess of fruitfulness and life and vitality and the spring. Well, Persephone was getting a little tired of her mother's afternoon tea parties and lace curtains. In fact, her mother wouldn't let her go out with those pretty sons of the gods. Well, anyway, one day Persephone was out in the fields with her little friends, and they were collecting flowers, wildflowers, and she had grasped onto this narcissus. And as you know, narcissuses are very difficult to root out. Anyway, she got this narcissus and pulled and pulled and pulled it, and finally it sort of popped out, and she fell back, and the hole that the narcissus had come from began to expand and to expand, and there was a roar, an increasing roar, and it got so that it was ear-splitting, and out of the hole came Hades. Hades was riding a chrome and black Harley Davidson. It was fully accessorized and customized, and he was on it. He was huge. He was hairy. He had his vest on, and she could see his muscles outside of his vest. He had no helmet, and his hair flew in the wind. She had never seen or imagined anything like that, so she looked sideways at him, and he saw that and smiled and took her and put her on the soft tail of the bike, and she held on tight, and they went straight down to Hades. Now you see, the problem here is that he had been living in Hades since time immemorial, and in fact he had seasonal affective disorder. He was depressed because it was so dark there. Persephone was full of light and beauty and song and spring. Anyway, she went down there and looked around. There were these old workshops, and in one particular workshop there were lights and cables, and there were electric attachments, and there were dimmer switches. And she said, now she had taken a degree in electrical engineering. So she immediately knew what to do. She put these things together, and she developed a sound system for Hades. And the sound system and the light system was consonant with a booming of the earth. And light appeared all over Hades, and tongues of light went in the dark corners, and the souls, all cold and dark there, started to wake up. And she made a fog machine, and the fog machine, she put lights with that, and these beautiful colors went around Hades, and the light and the blooming, and people woke up and they started to dance. They danced furiously, and the heat from the electrical equipment heated everything up, and the souls danced and danced and danced till they were hot and sweaty. Now, she got tired after doing so much work, and she missed her mother a little bit, so Hades said, "Come here, dear. Take these red pills." Now, some stories say that these were pomegranate seeds. We all know that they weren't pomegranate seeds. I mean, let's be real. Anyway, she did take the pills. Now, you know, when you're a captive, you must never, and remember this, you must never accept food from your captor or his. She accepted the 4 red pills. It made her feel better. She could dance longer, and she didn't miss her mother so much. But in the meantime, Demeter was looking for her daughter. She was looking high and low. She went to all of the corners of the earth, asking everybody and weeping. She went to the gods and asked them. No one could find her. And finally, she did find her daughter. And the ruler of Olympus said, well, she can come back and stay with you, but she has taken his seed 4 times. Therefore, she must stay there 4 months of the year. And those months of the year we call winter, because Demeter is so sad at the loss of her daughter that the crops don't grow. The sun becomes weak, and the birds fly away, and the earth withers. But as soon as Persephone is back, spring has come. Now, right now, Demeter is looking for Persephone, but because she's gone down there and she's dancing to that booming and rhythm down in Hades. Yeah.
This is a story I wrote a while ago, before I knew about Moth, because it's a personal story. And it's the working title is The Woodlot. When I am among the trees, especially the willows and the honey locust, but equally the beeches and the pines and the oaks, I find that I am surrounded by such a sense of gladness that I am almost saved. And daily, Mary Oliver. My brother bought 81 acres back in 1988 from an old dirt farmer named Lincoln Dodd. Lincoln Dodd had this parcel of land in Ottawa County in West Michigan, mostly sandy loam, and he farmed that poor land for corn for about 3 years till the land was even worse than it was before, and the Depression hit. And Lincoln did what so many farmers did during the Depression. He took the trees that the government provided and he planted them in this played out soil to try to hold that soil in place to keep it from blowing into the next county. And they didn't know a whole lot about what they were doing, but they were smart enough to know that you needed to plant a diversity of species. And so Lincoln did that. He planted red pine and Norway spruce and Scotch pine. And my brother bought that place from Lincoln years after he had planted those trees. And I remember going into that woodlot for the very first time. We walked out through the sheep pasture, and Sweep, my brother's border collie, ran out after those sheep, just begging us to call him to command those sheep to come up. And we opened the gate, and Sweep went before us first out into that woodlot. And you walk into the forest where the beech trees were growing. And beech trees don't grow in groves. They grow in herds. And they're massive, big, and that gray bark clings really tight to them. And those old beech trees, if you didn't look up, you could imagine that they were the legs of elephants or ancient dinosaurs that roamed in this place. And your imagination can go wild. And beneath those greater beech trees, you saw the young saplings, 12, 14 feet high, just dancing like young girls in the breeze that came off of the pasture. Behind them, oaks grew up, white oaks and ashes, and it's hard for me to tell sometimes the difference. The barks are so similar. They grew up as you walked up and over the hill that leads down to the gully where Deer Creek meanders down through this old woodlot, taking its time, knowing that once it leaves the gully, it enters the town and the abuses that will happen to most creeks when they go through a town. So it meanders through this space, and the hemlocks are there on the lee side of the hill, and their tops are bowed over, praying to the great tree from whom all trees come. Though I suspect that some of them are bowing over so they can see their reflection in the stream, for they are a bit vain. The cherries would grow, the woodland cherries were growing in the forest, their bark peeling off, and as you began to come up, and you see the oaks that come up and they grow and they open up like big martini glasses, their branches reaching out in praise to the sky, while the voluptuous maples grow, surrounded by their fecundity of little maples growing in those places. And you come up out of the gully and you turn left, north. And that's where Lincoln's trees mostly were. You see these big rows of Norway spruces growing, and I'm allergic to Norway spruces.
I'm allergic.
And they grow dark and dense, and you look deep into the shadows, and if you're there at just the right time, you'll see the fox peering out at you, or perhaps a barred owl perched on one of their branches. And then you go past the Norways into the red pines, and this is the part of the forest where the campsite was, where my brother would come out with his kids and his friend and her kids, and they would camp there and have a campfire and eat s'mores and campfire food, and they'd sleep out in the tents in the grove at night and see those stars in the sky or hear those barred owls calling. And I'm sure the memory of the campsite far exceeds the actual experience of being there, because that's how memories work. And you walk through this woodlands, and you can't help but be surrounded by such a sense of gladness. And my brother would spend his days out there after work, going through his forest. And now the woodland grove is down. Great trees fallen that had unearthly power to please the earthly sight, and gave unearthly solace to those whose minds grew quiet there. To live to mourn the loss of an ancient woodland, loved always with a love handed down, that is a grief that will outlive the griever. Wendell Berry. August 22nd, 1998. A windstorm blew through Ottawa County. Wind speeds up to 120 miles an hour had never been recorded in this area, and yet it swept through woodlots like my brother's. And in a matter of minutes, it was gone. My brother walked through the sheep gate that had blown open and shut it tight so the sheep couldn't escape, and saw the great beeches that had met him snapped off, 12, 15 feet high, fallen among the young ones that no longer danced at their feet. The great cherry that held the tree fort on its mighty limb, the limb broken down and the tree fort scattered on the ground. The oaks which tried to withstand the wind were broken and beaten, also losing many of their branches. As you walked through the detritus and the debris and the branches and the fallen logs, you walked the trail down toward the bridge over Deer Creek, and you turned and you saw the hemlocks who were protected by the hill. Their heads still drooped over, and you could almost sense them weeping the loss of their kin. You walk up, and it was Lincoln's trees, those 80-foot tall Norway spruces and red pines that took it the worst. The wind had whipped them and spun them around, and they fell just the way they lived, dying in each other's arms as they fell to the forest floor. My brother cried, as you do when you see the loss of such greatness and such wonder. And then he did the one thing you do. He took his chainsaw and he began to cut the trees up, and he cut wood for firewood, and when he had cut enough, he cut some more. And he began to pull the branches from the forest floor, and he made big piles of the branches throughout the woodlot. And when the winter snows had come, he lit them on fire and burned them like funeral pyres. The remaining trees, caught by the heat, going up and down, remembering their lost loved ones with whom they had shared existence. The space in the forest where the campsite was now completely exposed. and no longer filled with whimsum and wonder. And then it happened almost with Job-like precision. As if the windstorm wasn't enough, it had weakened the trees, and the red-headed pine sawfly came in and crawled under the bark of the red pines and ate the needles, so that the trees that were remaining began to die. And my father called the local forester to come in and harvest what was there, and they didn't care for the trees or the woodlot and knew that it would be a slim harvest that they'd pull out. And their big machinery came in after 2 or 3 weeks of rain and rutted the land that my brother had so tended, even as Lincoln had so tended it, and took the remaining trees out. Then the beeches got the blight, and their tight bark are the ones that were left, and the little ones all blistered out, and they too began to die. And the forest, as we knew it, was no more. Slowly they returned to the woodland left alone. Great trees, outspreading and upright, apostles of the living light. Wendell-Berry. I last visited my brother's woodlot in winter of 2011. The snow was deep, so I put on my snowshoes and I walked out through the neglected sheep fence. My brother had stopped tending sheep after Sweep had gotten old and died. The joy was somehow diminished in keeping the sheep. He thought about selling the land and moving. He was retiring. So I walked one last time through the woodlot. Walking through the remnants of the gate, I saw a 12-foot tall beech sentinel, still broken off at the top, still standing guard, as if that was her duty to remain. The detritus on the floor had been picked up and had 13 years to go back into that sandy loam, and so the forest was relatively clear as I crunched over the snow through the woodlot. And then something caught my eye. It was sort of a flesh-colored tube that stood up, and I walked over to it, and I looked down this 3-foot tall tube, and there was a tree inside of it. It was an oak, or perhaps an ash. I sometimes get them mixed up. And then as my eyes adjusted, I saw 2 more, and then 2 more, and I looked around. There must have been 50 of these flesh-colored tubes in this particular part of the forest. I walked down the hill over what was left of the bridge over Deer Creek, still meandering its way as though nothing had happened, and in its sense, nothing had happened. And I walked up to where the maples and the oaks were, and I saw that the forest had been cleared around, and the ones that were too broken had been taken out to give light to those who were still healthy, and they looked healthy. They looked well. And I turned the corner to where the great trees had been, the Norways and the red pines, and it was all filled with thickets and briars and brambles. I was pondering the old forest, and then under the 2 feet of snow, I saw it, sticking up just a bit. It was the top of a Norway spruce. And then another, and then a red pine. And then another, and then I saw a white pine over there. And then birches growing. And I walked and I counted 50 trees, 100 trees. I stopped after 200. There were too many trees to count. And as I walked around, I began to smile a little, thinking that in 5 years, those trees would be almost as tall as me. And in 10 years, it would start to look like a forest again. And that perhaps someday, there'd be a campsite out here again, filled with barred owls and campfires and wonder. I got back and I asked my brother about the trees. "How many did you plant?" I said. He paused for a minute. He thought. "About 10,000, he estimated. 10,000 trees. He said the land was too poor. It couldn't do it on its own. Maybe in 100 years, if it's still here, it could do it on its own. But not now. And knowing that those trees are there, I find that I am almost saved. And daily. The woodlot, in honor of my brother Paul Busman.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, but I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning